His first gift to his 19-year-old bride wasn't flowers, it wasn't gold. It was a key, and it broke her heart completely. Rose stood in the hallway of a stranger's house, still cold from the wagon ride up the mountain, still wearing the dress Mrs. Alderman had sewn in one night. The man she had married 3 hours ago held out a plain iron key and said without touching her, without smiling, "Every room in this house is yours. Except one. That one I'll ask you to leave alone." She took the key, and she cried. Not from fear, but because nobody had trusted her with anything in years. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story to the very last moment, then drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Rose's story travels. The morning Rose Bennett agreed to marry Luke McCall, she burned the breakfast biscuits. She didn't notice until the smoke rose and the smell hit the back of her throat. She pulled the pan off the iron stove and set it on the counter and stood there looking at the black bottoms of 6 biscuits and thought for just one moment that she might cry. Not about the biscuits. She had not cried since the day they buried her mother 14 months after they buried her father, and she did not intend to start again over bread. She scraped the pan and started over. Danny was still asleep. He slept hard those days, the fever medicine made him heavy and quiet, and the doctor in town had said that rest was the thing he needed most. Rest and food and dry air and a winter without drafts coming through the walls. The Bennett farmhouse had drafts in every room. Rose had stuffed rags into the gaps around the window frames and hung her mother's old wool shawl across the door to the back bedroom. But the cold still found its way in every November, sharp and persistent as debt. The bank notice had arrived on a Tuesday. The man who brought it was polite about it. He took his hat off and held it against his chest and said he was sorry for her situation. And Rose stood in the doorway and listened to every word he said. And when he was done, she thanked him and closed the door and went to the kitchen table and sat down and read the notice 3 times. $412. The loan her father had taken against the property when the mine closed. The note her mother had kept paying until she got too sick to work. The balance Rose had been making monthly installments on for a year, right up until Danny's fever hit in September, and the doctor bills started and the installments stopped. 40 days. She put the notice in the tin box where she kept important papers, and she went back to cooking dinner, and she did not say a word to Danny about it that night, or the next day, or the day after that. She needed time to think. She thought about going to the bank and asking for more time. She had done that already in August, and they had given her 30 days, and here they were again. She thought about borrowing from someone in town, but the town of Elk Ridge was small, and the people in it were not wealthy. And the ones who had money to lend were the same people who reported to the same bank. She thought about selling the livestock, but the livestock was already down to 2 chickens and an old mule with a bad knee, and selling them would leave her with nothing left to run the farm on, even if she kept the farm. She thought about all of it every night after Danny was asleep, and the house was quiet, and the wind came down off the mountains and pressed against the walls. It was Mrs. Alderman at the general store who said the name first. "Luke McCall is looking for a wife." Rose had been counting out coins for a bag of flour. She stopped counting. "People been saying it for weeks now," Mrs. Alderman said. She was a wide woman with careful eyes, and she spoke the way she moved deliberately and without waste. "His housekeeper left in September. He's got nobody up there on that ranch. Word is he went to see Judge Harlan last month and asked about the proper way to arrange a marriage contract." "A contract," Rose said. "Rose, that's what I heard. He's not a man given to romance, I'll tell you that. 34 years old and never been married. They call him the silent bear up on the mountain." Mrs. Alderman paused. "He's not cruel far as I know. He's just quiet. Keeps to himself. His ranch is solid though. 600 acres and good timber and a creek that doesn't run dry even in August." Rose finished counting her coins. She took her flour and thanked Mrs. Alderman and walked home. And that night after dinner, she sat Danny down at the kitchen table and told him about the notice. He took it better than she expected. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "How much do we need?" $412. "And McCall has it. McCall has a working ranch. The arrangement would settle the debt. Danny looked at her across the table. His eyes were too old for his face. He had their father's eyes, gray and clear and direct, and right now they were looking at her with an expression she recognized as the one he used when he was trying not to cry. "Rose. Don't. You can't." "I can," she said, "and I'm going to, so I need you to let me." He didn't say anything after that. He just sat there looking at the table, and Rose got up and started washing the dishes, and neither of them spoke again until morning. She sent word to Luke McCall through Judge Harlan's office. The reply came back in 2 days. A single sentence written in a plain, clear hand on decent paper. "If Miss Bennett is willing to meet, I will come to town on Saturday." He came alone. No lawyer, no friend, no hired man. He tied his horse outside the judge's office and came inside and took off his hat and stood in the middle of the room, and Rose got her first real look at the man she had agreed to consider marrying. He was bigger than she expected. Not just tall, which he was a full head above her, with broad shoulders that made the room feel smaller but solid in a way that spoke of years of hard physical work, rather than any attempt at impressiveness. His face was weathered and serious, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, and dark eyes that moved around the room once quickly, and then settled on her and stayed there. He did not smile. He looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he is trying to understand. "Miss Bennett," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Mr. McCall." Judge Harlan was there to make it official. He had drawn up a simple agreement. The terms were straightforward. Luke McCall would pay the $412 to the Elk Ridge Savings Bank, settling the lien on the Bennett property. The property itself would be transferred to Rose's brother Danny when he came of age. In exchange, Rose would marry Luke McCall and manage the household at McCall Ranch. It was not a romantic document. Luke looked at it and signed it without reading it a second time. Rose read every word twice. Then she signed it. Judge Harlan cleared his throat. "The ceremony can be performed this Friday, if that suits both parties." Luke looked at Rose. "Does Friday suit you?" "Friday suits me," she said. He nodded. "Then I'll see you Friday." He put his hat back on, said good day to the judge, and walked out. Rose stood at the window and watched him ride away. She had the strangest feeling standing there. Not fear exactly, not yet. Something quieter. The feeling of a door closing behind you in a room you can never go back into. Mrs. Alderman came by that evening with a piece of blue calico and told Rose she would make a decent enough dress if they started right now. "He didn't even look at me," Rose said. "He looked at you," Mrs. Alderman said, threading her needle. "He just wasn't making a show of it. There's a difference." Rose didn't answer. She stood on a chair while Mrs. Alderman measured the hem, and she looked out the kitchen window at the mountain ridge to the north, half hidden in low November cloud, and she thought about what was up there waiting for her and felt absolutely nothing she could name. Danny did not come to the wedding. She had not asked him to. He was still running a low fever, and she did not want him out in the cold. And the truth was, she did not want to look at his face across a room while she was doing what she was doing. She left him with Mrs. Alderman's daughter and told him she would come back for him as soon as she and Luke had settled in. She did not tell him when that would be. The ceremony took place in Judge Harlan's parlor. There were 4 people present: Judge Harlan, his wife, who served as witness, Luke McCall, and Rose Bennett. The judge read the words. Luke said the responses in that same low, unhurried voice. Rose said hers clearly because she had decided that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it straight and not mumble her way through her own life. When it came time for the ring, Luke reached into his coat pocket and took out a plain gold band and held it between his thumb and forefinger for a moment, looking at it. Just a moment. Then he took Rose's left hand carefully, as though her fingers might break, and slid the ring onto her finger. His hands were rough and warm. He released her hand as soon as the ring was seated. He did not kiss her. Judge Harlan did not ask him to. The whole ceremony lasted 9 minutes. Rose knew, because she had been counting. Afterward, they stood in the doorway waiting for Luke's wagon to be brought around from the livery stable, and they stood side by side in silence. And Rose thought that this was perhaps what the rest of her life would feel like, standing next to someone who existed at a remove from her, technically present, but fundamentally elsewhere. "Are you warm enough?" Luke asked. She turned to look at him. It was the first thing he had said to her since the ceremony. "I'm fine," she said. "It's colder up the mountain." "I've been cold before." He looked at her, then directly the same way he had in the judge's office, like she was a problem worth understanding. "I imagine you have," he said. The wagon came. He helped her up onto the seat without being asked, and then climbed up beside her, and they drove out of Elk Ridge in silence, and Rose watched the town disappear behind them, and thought about Danny's gray eyes, and the bank notice in the tin box, and the biscuits she had burned that morning. And she did not let herself feel any of it until the wagon had rounded the first mountain curve, and she was sure Luke McCall could not see her face. Then she allowed herself 3 deep breaths. That was all. The road up the mountain took nearly 2 hours. The ranch came into view just as the light was going, sitting against the shoulder of the mountain, with a creek running along the western edge and timber climbing the ridgeline behind it. The main house was long and low-roofed, built from rough-hewn logs, with a covered porch running the full length of the front. There were outbuildings, a barn, a smokehouse, what looked like a root cellar dug into the hillside, and fencing she could make out even in the dim light, running straight and solid as far as she could see. It was bigger than she had pictured, and better kept in most parts than she had expected. Luke brought the wagon around to the side of the house and got down and went straight to the horses without a word. Rose climbed down on her own and stood in the yard with her single bag and looked up at the house. Inside it was plain and clean. Not comfortable, there was a difference. The main room had a large stone fireplace with a good fire already burning, which meant he had been up here recently or had someone come to tend it. A rough-hewn table, 4 chairs, a shelf of practical books, farming records, almanacs, a Bible. No curtains on the windows, no pictures on the walls. Nothing that said a woman had ever lived here, or that anyone had ever tried to make it into the kind of place a woman might want to be. She put her bag down and started exploring. The kitchen was better than the main room, at least in terms of what it had. A proper iron stove, larger than the one at the farm. A good dry pantry with supplies, flour, salt, dried beans, a barrel of salted pork. Enough to last a hard winter. She opened every cabinet and checked every shelf and felt for the first time something close to professional satisfaction. At least she had materials to work with. There was a short hallway off the main room with 3 doors. She had opened the first 2, a small bedroom already made up with clean bedding clearly intended for her, and a washroom with a basin and pump, when Luke came in from outside and stood at the end of the hallway and looked at her standing in front of the 3rd door. "That one's mine," he said. She moved her hand away from the latch. "I wasn't going to—" "I know." He came down the hallway toward her, and she made herself hold her ground, even though every instinct she had said to step back. He was very large in the close space of the hallway. He stopped 2 paces from her, reached into the inside pocket of his coat, and took out a key. It was iron old and solid on a plain ring. He held it out to her. She looked at it, then at him. "What is this?" "House key," he said. "It unlocks everything. The main door, the cellar, the smokehouse, the barn." He paused. "Every room in this house." She took it slowly. "Every room, every room." He kept his eyes on hers. "Except one, the 3rd door. That one I'll ask you to leave." Rose looked down at the key in her palm. It was heavier than she expected. "Why are you giving me this?" For just a moment something moved across his face. Not emotion exactly, more like the shadow of it. The place where emotion had been a long time ago, and hadn't quite left. "Because this is your home now," he said, "and a person ought to have keys to their own home." He turned and walked back down the hallway and into the main room, and she heard him settle into the chair by the fire, and she stood alone in the hallway, holding the iron key, and felt something tear loose in her chest, not painfully, not like grief. More like the way a knot comes loose when you've been pulling at it for too long and suddenly the rope gives. She went into her room. She sat on the edge of the bed with the key in both hands. And for the second time in her adult life, Rose Bennett cried. Not because she was afraid. She had braced herself, for fear had been bracing since she signed the paper in Judge Harlan's office, and probably before that, since Mrs. Alderman first said the name Luke McCall over a bag of flour. She had been ready for fear. She was not ready for this, for a key on a plain iron ring, for a man who said this is your home now and meant it. She was not ready for kindness. Not from this direction. Not tonight. She pressed the key against her sternum until her breathing evened out, and then she washed her face in the basin and went to the kitchen and started on supper. He ate what she put in front of him without comment. That at least was straightforward. She made salt pork with dried beans and cornbread, simple and fast, and she set it on the table, and they sat across from each other for the first meal of their marriage. He bowed his head briefly before eating. She noted that. She noted everything about him the way she had trained herself to notice everything in any situation, the habit of a person who has learned that the details are where the safety lives. He ate steadily and without hurry. He did not look at her with any expression she could read as threat or desire or anything she needed to defend against. He just ate. When he finished, he said, "That's good." "It's plain," she said. "Plain is fine." He pushed back from the table slightly. "I want to say something." She went still. Here it is, she thought. Whatever the arrangement actually is. "I know this isn't what you chose," Luke said. "I know you married me because you were out of road and I was what was available." He said it plainly, with no self-pity and no accusation the way a person states facts. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise, and I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not." "What are you?" she asked. He thought about that for a moment. "A man who keeps his word," he said. "Whatever I told Judge Harlan, I'll do. Whatever you need to make this place livable for you, I'll provide if it's in my power. Your brother can come up when he's well enough. There's room." He paused. "What I won't do is make demands on you that a woman shouldn't have to meet from a stranger. You understand what I mean." She understood exactly what he meant. "Yes," she said. "Good." He stood up and carried his plate to the kitchen without being asked. She heard him set it on the counter. Then he came back to the doorway. "You should rest. The first few days up here are tiring while you adjust to the altitude. If you need anything in the night, don't hesitate." He went to his room. She heard the door close. Quietly, without emphasis. She sat at the table for a long time after that, with her hands around her coffee cup, looking at nothing. The fire had burned down to good steady coals. The house was quiet, except for the wind off the mountain, which she could hear now low and constant against the walls. She thought about Danny, asleep at Mrs. Alderman's daughter's house in town. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the kitchen table when she told him, the way his voice had cracked on the word can't. She thought about a man who gave iron keys instead of gold promises. She thought about the third door at the end of the hallway. Every room in this house, except one. She had a feeling about that door the way she sometimes had feelings about things before she understood them, a feeling that it mattered more than it appeared to. That whatever was behind it was the true center of Luke McCall, the place where the real story lived. She would leave it alone. For now, she would leave it entirely alone. She rose before dawn the next morning. The mountain was still pitch dark and bitterly cold, and had the kitchen fire going and coffee on before she heard him stirring. He came into the kitchen already dressed, hat in hand, and stopped in the doorway when he saw her. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," she said. "Sit down." He sat down. She put coffee in front of him and started on eggs from the small store she had found in the cool pantry. She could feel him watching her move around the kitchen, not uncomfortably, just watching the way a person watches something new in their space and tries to understand how it works. "The orchard," she said without turning around. "Those are apple trees." "Were," he said. "Haven't been properly tended in a few years." "I can tend them." He was quiet a moment. It's a lot of work. I've done a lot of work before. She set the eggs in front of him and sat down across with her own coffee. I'm not going to be a burden to you, Mr. McCall. I want to be clear about that. I intend to carry my share. He looked at her across the table. Luke, he said. What? My name is Luke. You're my wife. You might as well use it. She held his gaze for a moment. All right, she said. Luke. Something shifted in his expression just slightly at the edges. Not a smile, but the place where a smile might someday be if enough other things went right first. The orchard is yours if you want it, he said. The chickens are a good idea too. I'll build a proper coop if you want to start a flock. I'll want to, she said. He nodded and went back to his eggs. I'll want to teach the children from the neighboring ranches too, she said. On Sundays, if there's a space in the house we could use. He looked up at that. Not with objection, she watched his face carefully, and what she saw was closer to surprise. You were a teacher. I was going to be. Before. She didn't elaborate on the before. He didn't ask. I can teach reading and arithmetic, and I'm adequate at geography. If families are willing to send their children and someone provides the materials, I'll provide the instruction. Luke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, There's a back room we don't use. It's cold in winter, but I can put a stove in it. That would work. He drank his coffee and looked at nothing in particular. Why are you telling me all this? Because I want you to understand what kind of person you've taken on, she said. I'm not going to sit still and wait for the days to pass. I'm going to work. And I wanted you to know that from the beginning, so there's no argument about it later. For the first time since she had met him, Luke McCall almost smiled. It was brief and restrained, and he seemed a little startled by it himself. But it was there, a lightening around the eyes, a softening at the corner of his mouth. There won't be any argument, he said. Not from me. He finished breakfast and put his hat on and went out to the barn. Rose sat at the table with her coffee and listened to the silence of the morning and thought that she had expected many things from this marriage, and kindness was not one of them, and comfort was not one of them, and certainly not this quiet sense that the person across the table from her was interested at least in getting her right. She picked up the iron key from where she had set it beside her cup. She turned it over in her fingers once. Then she set it down and started cleaning up the breakfast things because there was a great deal to do, and she intended to start immediately. The first week passed in work. Rose had always worked hard. Necessity had trained her early and well, but there was something different about working on the mountain. The air was thinner, and the distances larger, and the tasks themselves had a scale to them that the Bennett farm never did. McCall Ranch was not a subsistence operation. It was a serious working cattle ranch, with a herd of nearly 80 head on the upper pasture, and agreements with 3 neighboring ranches for shared water rights on the creek. She learned all of this in pieces mostly by observation and by asking questions. Luke answered briefly, but always honestly. She learned that the ranch had been his father's before him, that his father had built the main house and cleared the first fields that Luke had taken over at 22 when the elder McCall died of a bad winter. She learned that he had at some point been engaged to be married. She learned this not from him, but from Mrs. Caldwell, the wife of the nearest neighboring rancher who came by on the 3rd day with a pot of venison stew and the friendly but highly specific curiosity of a woman who needed to know exactly what had happened at McCall Ranch. He was engaged 10 years ago, Mrs. Caldwell said, sitting at Rose's kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. Girl named Catherine. She died of typhoid the summer before the wedding. Luke, well. She looked into her coffee. He closed up after that. We all figured he'd stay closed. Rose absorbed this without comment. She poured more coffee and kept her face neutral. I'm not saying anything against him, Mrs. Caldwell added quickly. He's a good man, helps when help is needed, and doesn't ask for return. He just stopped being present, if you understand me. Like he was still here, but the part of him that matters had gone somewhere else. I understand, Rose said. We were glad to hear he'd found someone. Mrs. Caldwell looked at her with the direct measuring look of a woman taking stock. "You're young." "I'm 19. Does that concern you? Being up here away from town with a man twice your age?" Rose looked at her steadily. "What concerns me," she said, "is whether the orchard is salvageable and whether the soil in the south field will hold a kitchen garden in the spring. Those are the things I'm working on right now." Mrs. Caldwell looked at her for a moment and then laughed a real laugh surprised out of her. "Well," she said, "I imagine Luke McCall doesn't know quite what to make of you." "I think that might be accurate," Rose said. After Mrs. Caldwell left, Rose went to the window and looked out at the mountain and thought about a girl named Catherine who had died of typhoid 10 years ago, and about a man who had closed up like a wound trying to seal itself, and about a third door at the end of a hallway that held something she was not yet allowed to know. She thought about the iron key on its plain ring sitting on the nightstand in her room. Every room except one. She understood now at least what that room contained, or what it had contained 10 years ago, when Luke McCall was still a man who loved someone and believed the future would arrange itself the way young men believe it will. She did not feel sorry for him. That wasn't quite right. She felt something more complicated, a recognition, the way you recognize a kind of pain in someone else, because you've had a near neighbor to it in yourself. The particular loneliness of a person who keeps going after the thing that kept them going is gone. She knew something about that. She went back to the orchard and kept working. By the end of the second week, a pattern had established itself. Luke rose before her on most mornings. She would wake to the sound of the back door and the stamp of boots on the porch. But she was in the kitchen before the coffee was cold, and they ate breakfast together every morning. And he told her what he was doing that day, and she told him what she was doing, and it was businesslike and efficient, and gradually something more than that. He fixed things without being asked. She noticed at first with the back gate on the chicken coop she was building, she had mentioned offhand at breakfast that the latch was sticking, and when she went out after lunch, the latch had been replaced with a better one. She hadn't seen him do it. He hadn't mentioned it. She mentioned it at dinner. "The latch on the coop," she said. "It was sticking." "I know, I just said that this morning." He looked at her. "Was there a problem with fixing it?" "No," she said. "I just know. Thank you." He nodded and went back to eating. The next morning she found a small shelf installed in her bedroom, exactly the right height for the books she had brought with her, which until then had been stacked on the floor. She had not mentioned the books to him. He would have had to notice them himself. She stood in her room for a long moment looking at that shelf. Then she went out to the kitchen and poured his coffee before he asked for it, and he looked at her when she set it in front of him, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything about shelves or coffee or any of it. And she thought that possibly this was a language she could learn, this language of small acts and unspoken understanding, and that possibly she was already learning it faster than she expected. Danny came up at the end of the third week. He arrived on the supply wagon with a bag and his school books and the slightly overwhelmed expression of a 14-year-old boy who had never been this far up a mountain. He stood in the yard and looked at the ranch and then at Rose and said, "It's big." "It is." "And that's—" He looked at Luke, who had come out of the barn to help with the bags. "That's him." "That's him." Danny studied Luke with the expression he used when he was doing sums in his head, careful and systematic, and not particularly warm. Luke, for his part, looked at Danny with the same steady directness he brought to everything, and then he held out his hand. Danny shook it. "I've got a room off the barn that gets good light in the mornings," Luke said. "Your sister tells me you're studying for the territorial examination." Danny blinked. "She told you that?" "She did. If the room suits you, you're welcome to it. If not, we'll find another arrangement." Danny looked at Rose. She gave him nothing. It was his call. He looked back at Luke. "I'd like to see it," he said. Luke picked up Danny's bag before the boy could reach for it and walked him toward the barn. Rose watched them go, this large, quiet man and her brother, with their father's careful gray eyes, and felt something in her chest that was not quite pain and not quite relief, but something that lived between the two. When they came back inside for supper that evening, Danny was talking about the territorial examination, and Luke was listening. And at some point, Luke said something about what he had heard regarding the new school being established in Elk Ridge. And Danny said he wanted to be a doctor eventually. And Luke said that was a serious ambition, and a good one. And Danny said, "Do you think it's possible? From up here without money?" And Luke said, "You'll need schooling, and you'll need time, and you'll need someone to stake you. But those aren't impossible things, not if you work." Danny looked at his plate. Then he looked at Rose. And she saw in his eyes the question he wasn't asking, the question that was, is this real? Is this actually our life now? She didn't answer it with words. She passed him the cornbread. Later. After Danny was asleep and the house was quiet, Rose sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and heard Luke's footsteps in the hallway, and then stop, and then she heard the sound she had never heard before, the soft particular sound of the third door opening and closing. She sat very still. She thought about the key on her nightstand. She thought about every room except one. She thought about what a person keeps in the room no one else is allowed into, and what it costs to keep going back there night after night alone. She put her hand flat on the table. She left the door alone. She sat with her coffee until the fire died down, and the mountain went completely quiet, and she thought that she was going to have to be very careful about Luke McCall, not for the reasons she had expected, but because she was beginning against everything she had planned and prepared for to care what happened to him. That was going to complicate things considerably. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge, and the temperature dropped toward freezing. And the first real winter snow of the season began to fall on McCall Ranch, quiet and thorough and patient as grief. Rose Bennett sat in the kitchen and listened to it settle. She turned the iron key over in her pocket. And she thought, I am going to be all right here. We are going to be all right here. All of us. She didn't know yet how much that was going to cost before it came true. But she had signed the paper and worn the ring and climbed the mountain, and whatever was ahead of her, she was going to meet it straight on, the same way she had met everything else. That much had not changed. That much she was certain of. The snow that fell the night Rose made her quiet decision did not stop for 3 days. By the time it was over, McCall Ranch was buried under 18 inches of white, and the temperature at dawn had dropped to a place where breath came out in thick clouds, and the water in the wash basin had a thin skin of ice on it every morning. Rose cracked the ice, washed her face, and got on with the day. She had grown up in Colorado. She knew what winter meant, and she did not waste energy being surprised by it. What she had not expected was Luke. Not Luke the stranger she had signed a paper beside in a judge's parlor. Not Luke the large silent man who ate without comment and left before sunup. She was already adjusting to that version of him. What she had not expected was Luke during a blizzard, which turned out to be an entirely different thing. He spent the 3 snow days fixing every broken thing in the house, not loudly, not in a way that announced itself. He moved from task to task the way he did everything methodically, without explanation, as though the work itself was the only thing that needed saying. She came out of her room on the first morning to find him at the kitchen table with her father's pocket watch in pieces in front of him, a small case of tools open beside it, his reading glasses, which she hadn't known he owned, on the end of his nose. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked up. "It was running slow," he said. She looked at the watch. She looked at him. "Where did you find that?" "Your coat pocket. The lining's torn. I noticed it when I hung it by the door." He looked back down at the watch's movement. "I can fix the lining too if you want." Rose walked to the stove and put the coffee on, and did not say anything for a moment because she was not certain she could say anything without her voice doing something she would regret. That watch had been her father's. He had carried it in the mine every day for 11 years. It had stopped working the winter after he died, and she had kept it in her pocket anyway, because she could not make herself leave it behind, and she had learned not to look at the hands because they pointed to a time she could not get back. "How did you know to fix it?" she said finally. "I had a watch like this once. The regulator pin was the same problem." He set a tiny piece down on the cloth beside the watch face. It'll keep time now. She poured the coffee and put his cup on the table beside the watch parts and sat down across from him, and she watched his hands work large and careful, moving through the small mechanisms with a precision that seemed improbable for their size, and she thought about all the things a person could know about another person that they had not yet said out loud. "Thank you," she said. He didn't look up. "It's a good watch. Shouldn't sit still in someone's pocket." She drank her coffee and let the silence sit between them comfortably, and thought that this was the thing she had not understood yet about Luke McCall, that his silences were not cold. They were just quiet. There was a difference. Danny found this out on the second snow day. He had been working on his examination preparation all morning, and somewhere around mid-afternoon he came to the kitchen table with his arithmetic book and a look on his face that Rose recognized as the particular frustration of a problem he had been fighting for longer than he wanted to admit. Luke was at the table oiling harness leather. Danny sat down heavily across from him and stared at the book. "Geometry," Danny said to no one in particular. Luke glanced at the book without turning his head. "What's the problem?" he said. Danny looked at him. This was Rose realized from the kitchen the most words Luke had said directly to Danny since his arrival. "I can't get the proofs to work," Danny said cautiously. "I know the answer is right, but I can't show the steps." Luke set down the harness and held out his hand for the book. Danny passed it over with the expression of a person not certain this was going to help. Luke looked at the problem for about 15 seconds. Then he turned the book around and pushed it back to Danny, and picked up a pencil and said, "Start from what you can prove, not from what you want to prove. Work backward from here." He drew a single line in the margin. "What's this angle if you know these two?" Danny looked at it. Something shifted in his face. 60 degrees. "And if it's 60 degrees, what does that tell you about the opposite side?" Danny grabbed the pencil from Luke's hand without thinking the way you do when your brain is moving faster than your manners and started writing. Luke leaned back and watched him work. He did not speak again. He waited while Danny's pencil moved faster and then faster still, and when Danny sat back with the look of someone who has just won an argument with a wall, Luke said simply, "That's it." Danny stared at the completed proof. Then he looked at Luke. "You know geometry." "I built 6 structures on this ranch," Luke said. "You learn geometry, or your roof falls in." Danny almost laughed. It came out as a short, surprised sound like he'd caught himself. He looked back down at the book and then at Luke again, with the careful gray eyes that saw things straight. "Rose said you don't talk much." "I don't." "But you know things." Luke looked at him steadily. "Knowing things and talking about them aren't the same business." Danny considered this with the serious expression of someone filing it away for later. "Fair enough," he said. He went back to his proofs. Luke went back to his harness. Rose stood in the kitchen and kept her hands busy, and did not let herself look at them again for a long time, because if she did, she was going to feel something she was not prepared to feel in the middle of the afternoon on a Tuesday. On the third day the snow stopped, and Luke went out to check the herd, and while he was gone Rose made a decision about the orchard. She had been studying it for weeks, assessing each tree, testing the soil, figuring out what had been neglected, and what might still be saved. The damage was significant but not catastrophic. 10 of the 20 trees were still structurally sound, and could produce again with proper pruning in the spring. The other 10 were a harder case, but she had ideas about grafting stock from the healthier ones, and she had written to an agricultural pamphlet she'd read years ago for guidance on the specific variety. What she needed was Luke's permission to spend money on materials. It wasn't a request she was looking forward to making. When he came in that evening, she put dinner on the table and waited until they were both seated and then said, "I want to talk to you about the orchard." He looked at her. "All right." She laid it out plainly, what she had assessed, what she thought the timeline would be, what it would cost in materials and labor. She had written the numbers down on a piece of paper, and she put it on the table where he could see it. She did not ask for his opinion on whether it was worth doing. She told him what she believed and left the conclusion to him. He looked at the paper for a moment. This is your projection for harvest by the 3rd year. Conservative estimate, if the graphs take and we get a normal rain season, and if they don't take, then we've lost the material cost and some time. The labor is mine. I'm not counting that. He looked at her across the table. Why aren't you counting it? Because it's mine to give. He was quiet for a long moment. She held his gaze and did not fill the silence because she had learned in 3 weeks that filling Luke McCall's silences was the wrong instinct. He needed the space to think, and if you talked into it, you lost him. The orchard was my mother's project, he said finally. She planted it the year she married my father, tended it for 20 years. He looked down at the paper. I let it go. I know. He looked up sharply. Mrs. Caldwell told me it used to supply half the settlement, Rose said. She said your mother sold preserves all the way to Denver. Luke's jaw worked once. She did. Then it's worth saving. Rose picked up the paper and folded it and put it back in her apron pocket. I'm going to save it. I just need to know you won't object to the expenditure. The silence this time was different. Not the silence of a man thinking, but the silence of a man feeling something he had not expected to feel and was not certain what to do with. I won't object, he said. Good. She picked up her fork. Then that's settled. He looked at her for a moment more. Then he picked up his fork too. Rose. Yes. The apple trees my mother liked best were the ones along the south fence. She said they got the best light. Rose nodded once carefully. I'll start there. They finished dinner without another word about it. But when Rose went to bed that night, she lay in the dark with the iron key in her hand and thought about a woman who had planted 20 apple trees in mountain soil, because she believed in the future, and about the man those trees had grown up under, and about what it meant that he had just told her where to start. She thought it meant something. She was not yet ready to say what.
大家好，
The Sunday school started on the first clear weekend in December, and it was a larger enterprise than Rose had prepared for. She had expected maybe 5 or 6 children from the 2 nearest ranches. What arrived on that Sunday morning was 11 children ranging in age from 6 to 13, accompanied by 4 mothers who had no intention of leaving, plus old Mr. Garrett from the Garrett homestead 3 miles north, who was 81 years old, and had heard there was going to be reading and wanted to participate. Rose looked at them all assembled in the back room. Luke had put the stove in and made a rapid adjustment to her plans. All right, she said. I'm going to need paper and pencils for everyone. Mr. Garrett, can you read? I can read, he said with considerable dignity. I want to do arithmetic. Then you'll start with the older group. Children under 8 come sit with me. It was organized chaos for the first half hour, and then it was just organized, and by noon, Rose had every single person in the room working on something at their appropriate level, and she was moving between groups with the calm efficiency of someone who has always been able to hold multiple things in their head at once without dropping any of them. Luke stood in the doorway for a while. She noticed him but didn't stop what she was doing. When she finally had a moment to look up, he was gone. After the families had left, and Danny had gone to tend to the afternoon chores Luke had assigned him, which he had taken to with more enthusiasm than Rose had expected possibly, because physical work after a morning of books was exactly what a 14-year-old boy needed. Luke came into the kitchen where Rose was making tea and leaned against the doorframe. 11 children, he said, and Mr. Garrett. And Garrett. A pause. That's more than I thought. It's more than I thought, too. She put the kettle on. I'll need more materials. The paper won't last. I'll go to town Thursday. Make a list. She looked at him. He was looking at the wall to the left of her, which was the thing he did when he was saying something he wasn't entirely comfortable saying, not at her, but slightly past her, like the words needed a softer landing. You could have said no, she told him. About the room. About the families coming. I know I could have. Why didn't you? He looked at her then directly. Because this place has been quiet for 10 years, he said. And quiet isn't the same thing as peaceful. Rose held his gaze. She thought about Mrs. Caldwell's word present. She thought about the way he had described a man who was still there, but the part of him that mattered had gone somewhere else. She thought he was starting to come back. She did not say this. She was far too careful for that. But she thought it, and she put it somewhere safe inside herself, and she went back to her tea. The pocket watch was the first gift. What she hadn't realized then, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee, watching his careful hands reassemble what she had believed was broken past fixing, was that the pocket watch was going to be a pattern. A language. That Luke McCall, who could go entire days with fewer words than most people used in a paragraph, was a man who communicated primarily through what he did with his hands when no one was asking him to. She understood this fully on the morning she walked out to the chicken coop in her old boots, the ones with the hole in the left sole that she had been stuffing with folded newspaper since October, and found a pair of good winter boots sitting on the coop step. Not new, but well-made, barely worn, lined with sheepskin exactly her size. She stood in the cold and looked at those boots for a long time. Then she looked toward the barn, where she could hear Luke working. She went inside, sat down on the coop step, pulled off her old boots, and put on the new ones. She laced them up slowly, and stood up and felt the sheepskin warm around her feet and the solid sole under her, and thought, how long has he known about the hole? She went to the barn door. He was repairing a section of fence rail, his back to her. He did not turn around. Luke? Morning. The boots. He kept working. Winter's hard on bad footwear. Where did you get them? Mrs. Caldwell's boy outgrew them 2 seasons ago. She mentioned it when she was here last month. I asked if she still had them. Rose stood in the barn doorway. You've been planning this since last month. He was quiet. Luke. He set down the rail and turned around and looked at her steady and direct, the way he always looked at her when he had decided to stop pretending something wasn't happening. You had newspaper stuffed in your boot, he said. In November, on a mountain. I was managing. I know you were managing. His voice was even, but there was something in it she hadn't heard before. Not quite frustration, but its quieter neighbor. You manage everything. That isn't the point. Then what is? He looked at her. The space between them was 7 feet and felt like considerably less. The point, he said, is that you don't have to manage things like that here. Not when I can fix it. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. All right, he said. She went back out to the coop. He went back to the fence rail. And the thing that had passed between them in those 2 minutes, that wordless negotiation, that careful adjustment to each other, settled into the fabric of the ranch like everything else did, quietly and permanently. Danny noticed it before Rose let herself admit it. He said it at dinner one night in mid-December with the directness of a 14-year-old who had not yet learned to be subtle about things he observed. You two have gotten easier with each other. Rose looked at her plate. We found a rhythm. That's not what I said. Danny, I'm not complaining. He looked at Luke, who was eating with his usual steadiness. I just notice things. Luke looked up. What do you notice? Danny considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. She used to watch the door when you came in, like she was checking something. She doesn't anymore. The kitchen was very quiet. Rose did not look at Luke. She was aware of not looking at him the way you are aware of a sound that's just stopped by the specific quality of the absence. That's an accurate observation, Luke said. And you... Danny stopped, started again. You laugh now, not big, but sometimes. Another silence. I wasn't laughing before, Luke said. No, Danny said simply. You weren't. Luke looked at Danny for a moment. Then he looked at Rose. She made herself meet his eyes, and what she saw there was complicated and quiet and entirely unguarded in a way she was not ready for. She looked away first. Pass the bread, she said. The subject changed, but it didn't go anywhere. The days shortened and the cold deepened, and the routine of the ranch became the rhythm of Rose's life in the way that routines do when you stop fighting them. Not noticed anymore, just lived. She knew which boards in the hallway creaked. She knew that Luke took his coffee with 2 spoonfuls of sugar in the morning and no sugar at night. She knew that he checked on Danny's schoolwork without being asked and never made the boy feel checked on. She knew the sound of his boots on the porch steps and could tell by that sound whether he was coming in for lunch or just passing through. She knew that he went to the 3rd room some nights and others he didn't, and that on the nights he did, he was quieter at breakfast, and that she had stopped pretending not to notice. She did not know what to do with any of this. She did not know what to do with the fact that she was beginning to look forward to breakfast. That she caught herself sometimes composing things to tell him during the day. Small things, observations, something Danny had said, something she had read, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to see how he would respond. She did not know what to do with the fact that she had begun to understand his near smiles and his pauses, and the specific way he asked a question when he was actually asking something else. She was very careful. She had always been careful. But careful has limits, especially in small houses, in high mountains, in long winters, when you are 19 years old and the person across the table from you turns out to be nothing at all like what you expected. It happened on a Thursday 3 weeks before Christmas. She had been in the pantry taking inventory, a task she did weekly methodically in a small notebook she kept for the purpose when she heard the front door and Luke's boots, and then, instead of the usual movement toward the kitchen, a sound she didn't recognize. She came out of the pantry. He was standing in the main room with a small wooden box in his hands. He had just come back from the supply run to town. The box was old, well-made, but worn with the look of something that had been handled many times. He was holding it in both hands and looking at it, and he didn't hear her come in. She had never seen him look the way he looked at that moment. She stopped in the pantry doorway. He was absolutely still. Not the stillness of a man thinking, the stillness of a man who has been caught off guard by his own feelings in an empty room and doesn't yet know anyone is watching. His face was open in a way she had never seen it. The careful distance was gone. He just looked for 3 or 4 seconds, like a man standing very close to something that had hurt him badly and had been hurting him for a long time. Then he heard her. He looked up. Something shuddered in his face, not all the way, but partially. The practiced closing of a man who has learned to manage what he shows. He looked at the box in his hands, and then at her. "Came by the post office," he said. Rose didn't move from the doorway. "What is it?" He turned it over once in his hands. "Letters," he said. "Some old things of mine that were being stored at my uncle's house in Denver. He passed last spring." He paused. "I asked them to send me what was there." "I see." He stood with the box for another moment. Then he walked past her to the hallway, and she heard the 3rd door open and close. She stood in the main room for a long time. She thought about what Mrs. Caldwell had said, a girl named Catherine. She thought about the box, old, worn, smooth-handled many times. She thought about a man who had carried something for 10 years that he could not put down and could not bring himself to look at in front of anyone. She went to the kitchen and made dinner, and when he came out 40 minutes later, he sat down, and she put food in front of him, and neither of them said a word about the box. But she thought about it all evening, and after he had gone to bed, she sat at the kitchen table with her tea and the iron key beside her cup, and she made herself face a thing she had been avoiding facing. She cared about him, not as an arrangement, not as a business proposition or an act of survival or a marriage that existed on paper so her brother would not end up in an orphanage. She cared about Luke McCall, his careful hands and his near smiles, and the geometry he knew from building things that needed to stand, and the way he had put shelves on her wall without being asked, and asked Danny about his examination with the respect of one serious person talking to another. She cared about him, and she did not know what to do about it, because the woman he had loved was dead and in a box in the 3rd room, and Rose Bennett was a girl who had married him to pay a debt, and caring about someone under those conditions was either the most natural thing in the world or a disaster waiting to fully become itself. She picked up the iron key. Every room except one. She thought, what would it take for a man like that to finally open that room? She didn't have an answer, but she kept asking it. quietly, privately, through the long, cold evenings of December, while the mountain snow piled up outside, and the fire burned down, and the ranch around her breathed its slow, steady winter breath. She kept asking it, and she kept showing up at breakfast, and she kept learning the language of small things, and she kept telling herself that was enough for now, that it was enough to be building something solid, even if she did not yet know exactly what it was they were building. She was wrong about that last part. Not about the building, about the enough. But she wouldn't find that out until winter deepened, and Luke McCall carried a cedar chest out of the third room and set it at the foot of her bed with hands that weren't quite steady, and said the 6 words that split her understanding of him open from the inside. She wasn't ready for that yet, but she would be. It happened on a Saturday 11 days before Christmas. Rose was in the kitchen, teaching the 2 youngest Caldwell girls their letters, when she heard Luke's boots on the porch. Not his usual stride, which she could read the way she read weather, but something heavier and more deliberate. The walk of a man carrying something he has been deciding about for longer than the walk itself. She told the girls to keep practicing their A's and B's and stood up. He came through the door with a cedar chest. It was not large, maybe 2 feet long, 1.5 feet deep, but it was beautiful, in the way that things made by hand over a long time are beautiful. The wood was dark and smooth, carved along the lid with a simple pattern of mountain pine that someone had worked into the grain with patience and skill. He carried it in both arms carefully, the way you carry something that cannot be replaced. He set it at the end of the hallway, not in her room, not in the main room, just at the end of the hallway, and straightened up and looked at her. "When you have a minute," he said. He went back outside. Rose looked at the chest for a moment. Then she looked at the 2 little girls at her kitchen table, their tongues between their teeth, concentrating on the alphabet with the life-or-death seriousness of 6-year-olds everywhere. "Keep going," she said. "I'll be right back." She went and stood at the end of the hallway and looked at the chest. The third door behind her was closed. She touched the carved lid once, just the tips of her fingers along the pine pattern, and then she went back to her students. She didn't open it until that evening. Danny was doing his examination prep at the kitchen table. Luke had gone out after supper to check the west fence line, which had been giving him trouble all week, and Rose took the lamp from the hallway and carried it to her room and sat on the floor in front of the cedar chest and opened it. She did not know what she was expecting. She was not expecting letters. There were dozens of them, tied in small bundles with ordinary kitchen twine. The paper yellowed at the edges, the handwriting on the outside of each one careful and even, a man's hand, not a boy's, but the hand of a man who had written these when he still believed in what he was doing and had not yet learned to doubt it. No addresses on the outside, no names, just dates in that same careful hand going back 10 years. She sat on the floor for a long time without touching them. She understood immediately what they were. She understood the moment she saw them, the same way you understand certain things without wanting to, a knowledge that arrives fully formed and won't be argued with. These were letters to Catherine. 10 years of letters to a woman who had been dead for 10 years, written and never sent because there was nowhere to send them. She put her hand flat on the nearest bundle. Then she heard his boots on the porch, and she stood up and closed the chest and went to the kitchen and poured him coffee. And they sat at the table, and she did not say a word about what she had seen. Dar. He brought it up himself the next morning. She was at the stove when he came in, and he sat down, and she put his coffee in front of him and turned back to the eggs, and he said behind her, "I want to explain the chest." She kept her hands moving. "You don't owe me an explanation." "I know I don't." A pause. "I'm offering one." She turned around. He had both hands around his coffee cup. He was looking at the table, not at her at the table, and he had the expression of a man assembling something difficult in the correct order before he starts speaking. "Catherine died in August of 1874, he said. "We were going to be married in September. I had the ring." He stopped, started again. "I wrote to her for the first year after, not knowing what else to do. And then I kept writing because stopping felt like—" He stopped again. His jaw worked once. "It felt like forgetting her, and I couldn't do that." Rose sat down across from him. She did not speak. "The letters in that chest are everything I couldn't say to a living person for 10 years, he said. Every thought I had that needed somewhere to go. Every time I—" He looked up at her then. "I'm not telling you this because I want you to feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you've been in this house 2 months and you've handled everything I've put in front of you with more honesty than I've given you in return. And that isn't right." The kitchen was absolutely quiet. "Why now?" Rose said. "Because I carried that chest out of the 3rd room this week for the first time in 10 years. He held her gaze. "You know why that matters." She did know. She sat with knowing it, feeling the weight of what he was saying settle around her, this careful private man, handing her the most closed part of himself with both hands. "There's one more thing," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a single folded piece of paper and put it on the table between them. "The last letter I wrote," he said, "from 2 months ago, before I went to see Judge Harlan." She looked at the paper. She did not reach for it. "You can read it or not," he said. "That's your choice. But I want you to know it exists." He drank his coffee. He got up, put on his hat, and went out. Rose sat at the table and looked at the folded paper. She picked it up. Her hands were steady. She unfolded it and read. The letter was not long. Luke McCall was not a man given to length. But every sentence was exact and honest in the way that only things written for no audience are exact and honest, and by the time she reached the last line, her chest had tightened to a place that made breathing careful work. The last line said, "If life ever forces another woman into this house, I hope I never make her pay for my grief." She folded the paper. She put it on the table. She sat with it for a long time. She was not jealous. She understood that about herself very quickly, tested the emotion, found it wasn't there. What she felt was harder to name and more difficult to carry. It was the specific ache of understanding someone's loneliness from the inside, not by being told about it, but by reading the evidence of it. 10 years of letters to a dead woman written in a good, clear hand by a man who believed that keeping faith with the lost was the only honorable option available to him. She thought no one should have been that alone for that long. She thought, he has been carrying this the entire time I have been here, and he carried it without letting it become anyone else's weight. And that is either the most admirable thing I have ever encountered, or the saddest, and possibly both. She went to the window and looked out at the barn. Then she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, brisk and efficient one pass, and went to make breakfast for Danny. She did not tell Danny what was in the chest, but Danny, who noticed everything, noticed that she was different that day, quieter and more inward, moving through the kitchen chores with the automatic competence of someone whose body is doing one thing while their mind is fully occupied with another. "Are you all right?" he asked at lunch. "I'm fine." "You've been fine 3 times this morning, and you only say it that many times when you're not." She looked at him across the table. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "About what it costs a person," she said slowly, "to keep going after the thing that was keeping them going is gone." Danny was quiet for a moment. His gray eyes moved to the window and then back to her. "Are we talking about Luke, or are we talking about Mom?" The question hit her somewhere she hadn't been expecting it. "Maybe both," she said. He nodded slowly, the way he did when he was accepting a thing he didn't entirely want to accept. "He's not what I thought he'd be," he said. "What did you think he'd be?" "Harder." Danny turned his cup in his hands. "I thought he'd be the kind of man who bought a wife because he wanted something to own. Men like that are hard in a specific way. He's not that." He paused. "He's hard the way a person gets when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and they've forgotten they're doing it." Rose looked at her brother. "When did you become this perceptive?" she said. "I've always been this perceptive," he said. "You've just been too busy managing everything to notice." She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his, and then took it back, because neither of them were people who held on to things for longer than necessary. "He's trying," she said. "That's what I want you to understand. He's genuinely trying." "I know," Danny said. That's why I'm not worried about you anymore." She didn't know what to do with that. So she picked up the dishes and started washing them, and the afternoon moved forward, the way afternoons do on working ranches steadily, with a great deal to show for it, and very little ceremony. Duh. She had planned to wait. She was a careful person, always had been, and her carefulness had served her well through every difficult thing in her 29 years. Her parents' deaths, the debt, the decision to come up the mountain, all of it. Patience and precision, and the discipline not to move before she understood the ground under her feet. She had planned to take the letters out slowly, read them over time, let herself understand what they contained before she let herself respond to what they told her. That plan lasted until the following Thursday. She was alone in the house. Danny was at the Caldwell Ranch, helping with a fence project. Luke had arranged for him practical work that also happened to pay a small wage toward his examination fees. A detail Luke had arranged so quietly, Rose had only found out about it from Mrs. Caldwell, and she opened the cedar chest and took out the first bundle and untied the twine and started reading. She read for 2 hours. The letters were not what she had expected. She had braced herself for grief, for loss, for the raw specific pain of a young man writing to a dead woman. That was there. But underneath it, woven through every letter from the first year to the last, was something else, a mind. A particular, careful, deeply serious mind, working through questions that most men of his time and place never thought to ask themselves. Questions about land and obligation, about what a man owed the people around him, and what he owed himself, about loneliness, and whether it was a punishment or a choice, about what it meant to keep faith, and whether keeping faith with the dead meant anything at all if it cost you the living. He was not just writing to Catherine. He was writing to himself, using her as the audience, because she was the only one he trusted with the real version of his thinking. She read a letter from 1878, in which he wrote about a neighboring family losing their homestead to a banking claim. And the way he described it, his analysis of how the claim had been constructed, the legal mechanisms involved, the specific injustice of it, was sharper and more precise than anything she had read in the newspapers from that year. She read a letter from 1881 in which he described replanting the orchard after a hard frost, and wrote, "I keep thinking of something my father said, that the best time to plant a tree is when you don't know yet whether you'll live to see it fruit. I'm planting them anyway. I don't have a better argument." She read the letter from 6 months ago, the one he had given her, read it again now in context, and understood it differently. If life ever forces another woman into this house, I hope I never make her pay for my grief. Not an apology, a commitment. A man who had watched himself be absent for 10 years, making himself a promise to be present for the next 10. She put the last letter down and sat in the silence of the house for a long time. She thought, I have been reading the inside of this man. She thought, I have been reading who he actually is. Not who he appears to be, and who he actually is going to be a problem for me. She thought, I am already in trouble. She put the letters carefully back in order, tied the twine, placed the bundle back in the chest, and closed the lid. Then she went to start dinner, and she was very deliberate about every movement, chopping and measuring and tending the stove, because deliberate action was the thing she used when her mind needed somewhere steady to stand. Thawed. He noticed at dinner. He always noticed things about her that she didn't expect him to notice. It was one of the ways he was consistently different from what she had anticipated. This man, who appeared to be looking past everything, was in fact looking at everything with the specific attention of someone who has spent a long time in silence and therefore has a great deal of capacity left for observation. "You read them," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He kept eating. "Luke." He looked up. "The letter from 1881, she said, "about the orchard." He was very still. "That's why you told me where your mother's best trees were," she said. "You'd already been thinking about replanting them. You'd been thinking about it for 4 years. He set his fork down. "I don't understand," she said carefully, "why you were waiting." "I don't know either," he said. His voice was quiet and even. "I think I didn't believe it was going to last. The ranch." He paused. "Anything." "And now?" He looked at her across the table. The fire behind him had burned down to a good steady light, and in that light his face was open again the way it had been the afternoon she had seen him with the box, the careful distance gone, the real version of him visible. "Now I have a wife who has claimed the orchard and started a school in my storage room and made my brother-in-law someone worth knowing," he said, "so I'm starting to think it might last after all." The air in the kitchen changed. Rose kept her face level and her hands still. She had become very good at this, at feeling things completely, without showing all of what she felt, because she was not yet certain what she was allowed to show and what would cost her more than she could afford right now. "That's something," she said. "It is," he said. They finished dinner. But the thing that had been building between them, the small language of keys and boots and shelves and cedar chests, the language that neither of them had named, because naming it would change, it was different now. Something had shifted in its weight. It was heavier and more real, and Rose felt it every time she moved through the house, every time she heard his boots on the porch, every time he said her name in that low, unhurried voice. She felt it, and she was careful with it, and she told herself there was time to understand it better before anything was required of her. She was wrong about the time. 3 days before Christmas, a man named Aldous Crane rode up to McCall Ranch. Rose was in the chicken coop when he arrived. She heard the hoofbeats and then Luke's voice, and then another voice unfamiliar with the smooth, particular flatness of a man who has practiced sounding reasonable. She came out of the coop with a basket of eggs and stood in the yard and looked at the stranger. He was well dressed for a mountain visit. Too well dressed. A good coat, a good horse boots, that had not done a day's work in the mud they were currently standing in. He had a paper in his hand that he was holding out to Luke, and Luke was looking at it with the stillness he used when something required a great deal of control. "Mr. McCall," the man was saying, "the Crane Timber Company has filed the claim through the Territorial Land Office. The documentation is completely in order. We're not asking you to vacate the whole property, just the upper pasture, 50 acres along the North Ridge." Luke's voice was flat. "That pasture has been McCall land for 32 years. According to our survey, according to my deed. The deed you're referring to may have a boundary irregularity." Crane smiled. It was the smile of a man who had used it many times on many people and found it effective. "These things happen with older filings. The land office has been very clear that our claim—" "Get off my property," Luke said. The smile did not entirely disappear. "Mr. McCall, that's the only thing I'm going to say to you," Luke said. "Get off my property." Crane looked at Rose. She looked back at him without expression. He looked back at Luke. "You'll be hearing from our attorney," he said. He rode out. Luke stood in the yard after the hoofbeats faded, holding the paper Crane had left, and Rose came to stand beside him. She could see his hands, how carefully still he was holding them, which was the tell, the one thing that gave away what the face did not. "Let me see it," she said. He handed her the paper. She read it twice. It was a land claim filing official territorial form, citing a survey conducted in October, and a boundary adjustment that placed 50 acres of Luke's upper north pasture under Crane Timber Company ownership. The language was careful and professional. The citation numbers were real. She could see they were real, not invented, which meant someone at the land office had participated in this. "This isn't right," she said. "No," he said. "It's not. There's a surveyor listed." She looked at the name. "Hartwell and Associates. They're based in Denver." "I know who they are?" His voice was controlled in a way that cost him something. "They've done 3 other filings in this county in the last year. All of them disputed. 2 of them went to court." She looked at him. "Did those families have their deeds?" "One did." "What happened to that one?" "They won." He paused. "But it took 2 years and they nearly lost the ranch paying for it." Rose looked back at the paper. "Where are your land records?" "Filing cabinet in the house. Everything from my father's time forward." "All right." She handed him back the paper and picked up her egg basket. "Then we start there." He looked at her. "Rose, "We're not losing 50 acres of this ranch," she said. "Not to that man in those boots. So we start with the records, and we figure out what we actually have, and then we figure out what to do with it." She met his eyes. "You didn't marry a woman who runs from paperwork." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't." She went inside. He stood in the yard for another moment. Then he followed her. The filing cabinet had not been properly organized in years. Luke admitted this without embarrassment. He was a man who ran a physical operation, and the papers had accumulated in the way papers do when the person responsible for them is more comfortable in a saddle than at a desk. Rose sat on the floor of the main room, with the cabinet drawers open and sorted documents into piles, with the systematic calm of someone who had been keeping books since she was 13 years old. Luke brought her coffee and sat in the chair nearby and watched her work. Danny came home from the Caldwell Ranch and took one look at the organized chaos on the floor and sat down cross-legged in the middle of it without being asked. "What are we looking for?" "Original land grant," Rose said. "Survey maps. Any boundary documentation from when Luke's father filed." "How far back?" 1852 is when the original filing was made," Luke said. Danny whistled low. "That's 32 years of paper." "Then we'd better keep moving," Rose said. They worked for 3 hours. At the end of those 3 hours, Danny held up a folded document from the bottom of the third drawer, creased and brown at the edges, but intact, and said, "Is this it? Original territorial land grant McCall property dated April 1852, surveyed by the Colorado Territorial Land Office." Rose took it from him and opened it carefully. She looked at the boundary description. She looked at the survey measurements. She looked at the notation at the bottom in the territorial surveyor's hand. "Luke," she said. He was beside her immediately. "Read the northern boundary description," she said. He read it. His jaw tightened. "The north ridge line goes to the pine stand," he said, "which is 12 feet past what Crane's filing claims is the boundary." She folded the document carefully. They moved the line. 12 feet on paper translates to 52 acres on the ground, he said. 52 acres of timber worth. She looked at him. "A great deal of money to a timber company," he said. His voice was very quiet. They looked at each other. "We need a lawyer," she said. "We need more than that." He stood up. "If they did this to us, they did it to the Caldwells, and to the Garretts, and to the Pearsons on the east side." Rose sat very still. "How many ranches border the North Ridge?" 7, he said, "including ours." 7 ranches, 50 acres each. The numbers assembled themselves in her head with the automatic precision of a woman who had been managing other people's books since before she was old enough to vote. "This is not an opportunistic fraud," she said slowly. "This is a system." Luke was already at the coat rack. "Where are you going?" she said. "Caldwell's." "It's dark. Caldwell needs to know tonight." He pulled on his coat. So do the others. "Luke." He stopped. She looked at him from the floor, surrounded by 32 years of paper holding a document that was worth more right now than everything else in the filing cabinet combined. "Bring the other families here," she said. "Don't go to each one separately. Bring them all here at the same time, so we can look at all the filings together. If they're all constructed the same way, then one case proves all of them," he said. "Exactly." He looked at her. And in the particular way he looked at her right then. Not the near smile, not the careful distance, but something more direct and more unguarded than she had seen from him since the letter about the orchard. She understood that they had crossed a threshold. Not a romantic one. Something more solid than that. The threshold of 2 people who have decided without saying it out loud that they are on the same side of every fight that is coming. "Saturday," he said. "I'll get them all here Saturday." "I'll make enough food for 20 people," she said. He went out. Danny looked at Rose. "He didn't ask you if you were willing to do all this," he said. "No," she said. "You're not bothered by that." He didn't ask because he already knew. She smoothed the land grant on her knee. That's different from not asking because he doesn't care. Danny thought about this. That's a fine line. Most of the important lines are, Rose said. She started organizing the documents into order of date, working steadily in the lamplight, while the mountain wind came down off the north ridge, their ridge, 52 acres, of which a man in clean boots had ridden up to claim 3 days before Christmas, and pressed against the walls of McCall Ranch, with the patient persistence of something that believed incorrectly that it could get inside. It couldn't get inside. Rose had checked every window and every door, and there were no drafts. She had made sure of that personally 2 months ago, the first week she arrived. She kept working, and somewhere in the back of her mind, under the clean mechanical satisfaction of organized documents and clear legal strategy, something else was running quiet and steady as the creak in August, the last line of Luke McCall's letter, the one she had read 3 times now and memorized without meaning to. If life ever forces another woman into this house, I hope I never make her pay for my grief. She thought he didn't. She thought he did the opposite of that. She thought I need to be very careful about what I do with that information. Outside, she heard his horse on the frozen road heading toward the Caldwell Ranch in the dark, and she pressed her hand flat on the original land grant and thought about 52 acres on the North Ridge, and a cedar chest full of 10 years of letters, and an iron key on a plain ring that opened every room in this house but one. One room. And she understood, sitting on the floor with her brother beside her, and 32 years of paper spread around her, that the third door was open now. Maybe not unlocked, maybe not all the way, but open, and that was either everything or the beginning of everything. She was not yet sure which. Saturday came with a hard frost and 7 families. Rose had made enough food for 20 people and ended up needing it for 23. The Caldwells came with their 4 children. The Garretts sent old Mr. Garrett and his son's wife. The Pearsons came as a unit of 5, and 3 other ranching families Rose had only met through their children on Sunday mornings arrived with their husbands and their records and their faces carrying the particular expression of people who have been worried in private for too long and are relieved to finally be worried in company. She fed them all first. This was a decision, not an oversight. She had learned from her mother that people think more clearly when they are warm and not hungry, and that asking a group of proud mountain ranchers to admit they were afraid of a land claim was going to go better after cornbread and venison stew than before it. Luke watched her manage the room and said nothing, but she caught him looking at her twice with the expression she had come to understand as the one he used when she did something that surprised him, not because he thought her incapable, but because the specific form of her competence kept arriving from directions he hadn't anticipated. When the food was cleared, she put the original McCall land grant on the table. This is what Luke's father filed in 1852, she said. The northern boundary line runs to the pine stand on the ridge. That's documented here in the territorial surveyor's notation, and it places the boundary 12 feet past where Crane's filing claims it sits. The room was quiet. What does 12 feet mean on the ground? Tom Caldwell asked. 52 acres, Luke said. Per ranch. We don't know yet. Rose looked around the table. That's what we need to find out. Has anyone else received a claim notice from Crane Timber? 4 hands went up. She looked at Luke. He looked back at her. All right, she said. I need everyone who received a notice to put their original land grant on this table. Right now. There was a shuffling, a reaching into coat pockets and canvas satchels, a laying out of documents in various states of preservation. Rose went through them one at a time, and Danny sat beside her and wrote down the boundary descriptions in his careful examination hand. And by the time they were done, the kitchen table was covered in paper, and the room had gone very quiet with the specific silence of people beginning to understand the size of something. 5 of the 7 families had received Crane notices. All 5 boundary adjustments moved the same direction. All 5 removed acreage along the North Ridge. How much total? Luke said. Rose looked at Danny's notes. 240 acres, combined. Somebody in the back of the room said something short and unprintable. Tom Caldwell leaned both hands on the table. What does Crane want with 240 acres of ridgeline? Timber, Luke said. The pine stand runs the full length of the North Ridge, If they can claim the land under it, they can log it without trespassing, Rose said. And the families whose pasture sits below it lose their windbreak, which means their livestock get hit hard by every north wind that comes through. She looked up. Which means the land becomes less productive. Which means when the bank calls in any outstanding notes, the families can't pay, old Mr. Garrett said from the end of the table. His voice was dry and precise, the voice of a man who had watched other schemes in his 81 years and recognized the shape of this one. So they sell, at whatever price Crane is offering. The room was very still. It's not just the timber, Mrs. Caldwell said. No, Rose said. It's not just the timber. It's not. Luke straightened up from where he'd been leaning over the table. His face was the controlled face he wore when something required complete management. We need to take the original grants to Judge Harlan. Harlan can't hear a land dispute at this level, said a man named Pearson from the far side of the room. It has to go to the territorial court in Denver, and that means a lawyer, and a lawyer means money. The word landed in the room the way it always did among people who didn't have enough of it. Rose had been waiting for this. She had been thinking about it since Thursday night on the floor with the filing cabinet. There's another way, she said. Everyone looked at her. We don't need to hire separate lawyers for 5 separate cases, she said. We have 5 cases with identical construction, same company, same fraudulent surveyor, same method. If we file them jointly, one consolidated complaint to the Territorial Land Commissioner, not the court, we skip the lawyer fees, and we hit Crane where he doesn't expect it. She looked at the room. The Territorial Land Commissioner has authority to review and invalidate fraudulent survey filings. It's a faster process than a court case, and it doesn't require us to fund individual legal representation. Silence. How do you know that? Pearson said, not hostile, genuinely wanting to know. My father worked for a land claims assessor for 2 years before the mine, she said. I kept his books. I read everything he brought home. She paused. And I spent Thursday and Friday night reading the territorial land statutes that Luke keeps in his filing cabinet. Luke, who had not known she had done this, looked at her. She kept her eyes on the room. You read the statutes, Pearson said slowly. Yes. In 2 days. I read quickly. Old Mr. Garrett made a sound that might have been a laugh. Son, he said to Pearson, I'd suggest we let the woman keep talking. They stayed until past dark. By the time the last wagon had gone down the mountain, the shape of what they were going to do had been hammered out on the McCall kitchen table, a joint filing to the Territorial Land Commissioner with Rose drafting the consolidated complaint, each family providing their original documentation, and a courier to Denver within the week. Luke closed the door behind the last family and turned around. Danny was at the table gathering papers into neat piles. Rose was standing at the kitchen window with her arms crossed, not looking at anything in particular, the posture she used when her mind was still running hard on a problem her body had stopped moving to address. You're going to write the complaint yourself, Luke said. It was not quite a question. Someone has to, she said. And I understand the construction of it better than anyone else in that room. That's going to be a significant amount of work. She turned from the window. Yes. And you're going to do it while running the house and the school and the orchard planning. I've run harder schedules, she said. When Danny was sick and I was working the farm and the bank was coming, I was doing 4 people's work. This is 2 people's work. It's manageable. He looked at her for a long moment. You didn't tell me you read the statutes. I was still working through them Thursday when you came to bed. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure. Sure of what? That there was a real path. She held his gaze. I don't bring you problems. I bring you options. Something moved across his face, deep and unguarded, the way things moved across it when he stopped managing. He crossed the kitchen in 4 strides, and she had exactly enough time to think, oh, before he stopped directly in front of her, close the kind of close that was not accidental, and was not about the complaint filing, and looked at her. Rose, he said. She looked up at him. Her heart was doing something specific and unhelpful. Thank you, he said, quietly, Completely. She held his gaze. Don't thank me yet. The filing hasn't been accepted. I'm not thanking you for the filing. The kitchen was very quiet. Danny had stopped moving papers. Rose became aware that she and Luke were standing approximately 8 inches apart in the kitchen, and that her brother was watching them with the bright, attentive expression of someone trying to look like he wasn't watching. She stepped back half a step. Not away, just back. Danny, she said without looking at him, go to bed. I'm not tired. Go anyway. A pause. Then the sound of a chair and footsteps and the door to his room. She looked at Luke. He was looking at her with that same direct, unguarded expression. She had learned to read most of his faces now, but this one was still new enough that she wasn't certain what to do with it. We should establish something, she said carefully. All right. I came up this mountain to save my brother and pay a debt. That was the arrangement. I know what the arrangement was. And the arrangement has... She stopped, chose the word carefully. Changed, in ways I did not anticipate. He waited. I need to know, she said, whether you are aware of that. Yes, he said, simply and without hesitation. And whether it concerns you. He looked at her steadily. What concerns me, he said, is whether it concerns you. She thought about the letter. I hope I never make her pay for my grief. She thought about boots with sheepskin lining on a coupe step, about a shelf on her bedroom wall, about 3 hours of geometry and a pocket watch reassembled from pieces. No, she said, it doesn't concern me. He nodded once slowly, as though this answer was being filed somewhere important. Then we understand each other. We understand each other, she said. She turned back to the table and started helping with the papers, and he went to the stove and put more wood on the fire, and they worked in the kitchen together, in the quiet. That was not silence for another hour, and nothing more was said about it, and nothing more needed to be. She drafted the complaint in 6 days. She wrote it at the kitchen table after Danny was asleep, and before Luke rose in the 2 hours at the end of night and the 2 hours before dawn, when the house was entirely hers. She was precise and methodical about it, identifying the statutory basis for the Territorial Land Commissioner's jurisdiction, citing the specific measurements from each original grant, documenting the pattern across 5 separate filings, to establish that the fraud was systematic, rather than incidental. She also wrote a supplementary document she had not discussed with anyone. She had found it in the statutes on Friday night, a provision she almost missed because it was buried in a section about mining claims rather than agricultural ones. A provision that held that any surveyor found to have submitted fraudulent boundary measurements to the Territorial Land Office could be barred from practice and subject to criminal referral. Not a civil matter. Criminal. She wrote the supplementary document carefully and precisely, citing the provision, and she put it at the back of the consolidated filing, where it would not be the first thing anyone read, but would be very much the last. She showed it to Luke on the morning she finished. He read it. Then he read it again. You're going after the surveyor directly, he said. If Crane can bribe a surveyor once, he can do it again, she said. We stop the company by taking the tool away. Luke set the paper down. That's going to make Crane angry. He's already trying to steal your land. I'm not sure angrier makes a meaningful difference. He looked at her across the table. It might make him less careful. Or more desperate. She picked up her coffee. Either way, we'll know what we're dealing with. He thought about this. You've thought about the risk. Extensively. And you still want to include it. Yes, he nodded. He went back to reading. She watched him read, and thought about what it was like to have someone who read everything she put in front of him with complete seriousness, who never told her she was overcomplicating things, or thinking too hard, or worrying unnecessarily. She had been the person in every room who carried the most careful attention and the longest view, and she had been that alone for a long time. She was not alone at this table. She was aware of this with a clarity that was almost physical. Send it, he said. She sent it. Harv, Aldous Crane came back on a Tuesday. He came with a man this time, a lawyer younger with the tight, careful mouth of someone paid to manage situations before they became embarrassing. They rode up to the ranch in the mid-morning, and Crane tied his horse and came to the door and knocked the way a man knocks when he has decided to be reasonable. Rose opened the door. Crane looked past her. "I'd like to speak with your husband." "You can speak with me," Rose said. He smiled the same smooth smile he had used on Luke 3 weeks ago. "Mrs. McCall, I appreciate that, but this is a legal matter." "Then you'll be glad to know I wrote the filing to the Territorial Land Commissioner," she said, "which means I'm more directly relevant to the legal matter than my husband. Would you like to come in, or would you prefer to have this conversation in the cold?" Crane's smile developed a quality it hadn't had before. He came inside. Luke was at the table. He did not stand up. He looked at Crane and then at the lawyer and then at Rose, and she read his face and gave him a slight nod. "I have this," and he stayed where he was. Crane sat down. The lawyer set a document on the table. "The Crane Timber Company is prepared to offer a settlement," Crane said. "Given the questions that have been raised regarding our survey, we are willing to withdraw the current boundary adjustment in exchange for a timber rights agreement covering the North Ridge acreage." Rose looked at the settlement document. She did not touch it. "You want to withdraw the land claim," she said, "in exchange for logging rights on land you were trying to steal." Crane's smile went tight at the corners. "I wouldn't characterize it—" "What percentage of the ridge?" she asked. "The agreement covers—" "What percentage?" The lawyer cleared his throat. 80% of the North Ridge timber over a 40-year period. At what rate of compensation to the landowners? The agreement provides for a per-acre, annual or one-time payment upon. "No," Rose said. Crane looked at her. "I beg your pardon?" "No," she said again. "We won't accept a settlement that trades a fraudulent land grab for permanent logging rights at a one-time rate. If Crane Timber wants access to the North Ridge, they can negotiate a legitimate timber agreement at market rate annually, with a 20-year cap and full restoration requirements." She paused. "And they can do it after the Territorial Land Commissioner has completed his review of the fraudulent survey filing and the supplementary criminal referral." Complete silence. Crane looked at the lawyer. The lawyer looked at the document. "Criminal referral," Crane said. His voice had lost its smoothness. "For the surveyor," Rose said, "and potentially for the person who commissioned the fraudulent survey, depending on what the commissioner finds." Crane stood up. The reasonable manner was gone. What was underneath it was harder and less pleasant and considerably more honest. "Mrs. McCall, I want you to understand that Crane Timber Company has resources and connections in the territorial government that—" "Sit down," Luke said. It was the first thing he had said. He said it quietly, the way he said everything, but there was something in it that was not quiet at all, the specific tone of a man who has decided he is done being patient and is letting you know before things change significantly. Crane sat down. "My wife has explained our position," Luke said. "The 5 families on this mountain have original land grants that predate your survey by 30 years. We have a consolidated filing with the Territorial Land Commissioner and a supplementary criminal referral that is already in Denver. Whatever connections you have in the territorial government, I'd suggest you determine how many of them are willing to associate themselves with a fraudulent survey scheme before you make any more claims about resources." He paused. "Now, you came up here with a settlement offer. We've declined it. You're welcome to make a different offer. You're also welcome to leave." "What?" "Don't what?" Crane looked at him, then at Rose, then at the lawyer. He stood up. He picked up the settlement document. He went to the door and put on his hat and said without turning around, "You'll regret this." "Possibly," Rose said, "but not as much as you will." The door closed. Danny's voice came from the hallway where he had been standing very quietly for the last 10 minutes. "He's going to do something." "Yes," Luke said. "What do we do?" Rose was already at the desk pulling out paper. "We write to the other families tonight. We tell them Crane came with a settlement offer and we declined it. We tell them to expect pressure on their banknotes, on their supply contracts, on anything Crane can reach. She looked at Luke. Who holds the notes on the Pearson Ranch? Elk Ridge Savings. Who sits on the board of Elk Ridge Savings? Luke was quiet for a moment. Then he said Gerald Hatch. And Gerald Hatch is Crane's brother-in-law, Luke said. The kitchen was very still. Danny, Rose said, get your writing materials. The pressure started within a week. The Pearsons got a notice from Elk Ridge Savings accelerating their loan payment schedule. The youngest Caldwell boy lost his apprenticeship with the Elk Ridge blacksmith, who was suddenly overstaffed. The supply merchant in town told 2 of the 5 families that their credit terms had changed effective immediately, cash only. Rose cataloged every incident in a notebook. Date family affected nature of the pressure connection to Crane, where she could establish it. The notebook grew quickly. She sent copies of the entries, along with a letter she wrote with cold precision, to 3 places: the Territorial Land Commissioner, the Denver newspaper, that had been covering land fraud cases in Colorado Territory for the past 18 months, and a lawyer in Denver named Whitfield, who had successfully argued 2 territorial land cases in the previous year, and whose address she had found in a legal directory she borrowed from Judge Harlan. She did not tell Luke about the newspaper letter until after she had sent it. He found out when Danny mentioned it at dinner. He put down his fork. You contacted a newspaper? Yes. Rose. A land fraud scheme affecting 7 families and involving a corrupt surveyor and banking pressure is a story a newspaper will print, she said. And a story a newspaper prints is pressure Crane can't make go away by calling in loans. He looked at her across the table. She looked back. When did you send it? He said. 4 days ago. And you didn't tell me. I was going to tell you when I had a response. She held his gaze. I didn't think you'd object. I don't object. His voice was careful. I want to know what you're doing when you're doing it. Not after. This was fair. She knew it was fair. You're right, she said. I should have told you. He picked his fork back up. Danny was looking at the table with the elaborate attention to his food of a person who is present in a room that is not quite his. Who's Whitfield? Luke said. A lawyer in Denver who wins land cases. Did he write back? Not yet. Luke ate. When he does, tell me immediately. Yes, she said. Danny reached for the bread, and Rose passed it to him, and Luke refilled his own coffee, and the dinner continued, and there was a tension in the room that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but something with the properties of both the tension of 2 people who are fighting the same battle from slightly different positions and have not yet found the exact form of their partnership. They found it 3 days later. Whitfield wrote back on a Thursday. He wrote that the case, as Rose had described it, was compelling, that the systematic nature of the fraud across 5 filings was unusual and significant, and that if the original grants were as clearly documented as she indicated, the Territorial Land Commissioner would have strong grounds for invalidation. He also wrote that he would take the case on a contingency arrangement, no fee, unless the commissioner ruled in the family's favor, at which point Crane Timber would be liable for legal costs. Rose read the letter at the breakfast table with Luke beside her. When she finished, she put it down and he picked it up and read it himself. Contingency, he said. No upfront cost. He's confident. He wouldn't take it on contingency if he wasn't. Luke set the letter down. He looked at the table for a moment in the way he looked at things when he was making a decision he'd been approaching for a while and had now arrived at. Then he looked at Rose. I need to say something to you, he said. She waited. I have been running this ranch alone for 10 years, he said. Every decision, every problem, every crisis. Alone. He paused. That becomes a habit, not a good one. He looked at her directly. The newspaper letter, the lawyer, the supplementary criminal referral. You did those things without telling me because you're used to being the only person in the room who sees the whole picture. She started to speak. I'm the same, he said. Same habit, different reasons. He picked up the letter and put it back on the table between them. I want to change that. The way we're running this separately, even when we're in the same room, that's not what this should be. She looked at him. What should it be? He met her eyes. You tell me something. I tell you something. We decide together. Even when I've already worked it out. Even then, I might see something you haven't. You might not. I might not, he agreed. But I'd like the chance. She thought about this. She thought about being 19 years old with her hands on every lever because no one else was willing to hold them, and about how efficient that was and how entirely lonely. All right, she said. All right, he said. He picked up the Whitfield letter. Then together do we engage him? Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, he said. Danny, who had been eating with complete concentration, looked up. Was I supposed to weigh in on that? No, they said simultaneously, and in the same tone. And Danny looked between them, and for the first time since he had come up the mountain, he laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and young. The laugh of a 14-year-old boy who has been carrying too much worry for too long and has just set it down. The hearing before the Territorial Land Commissioner was scheduled for the first week of March. The 5 families came to McCall Ranch the week before to go over the documentation together. Rose had organized everything into a single case file, the original grants, the comparative boundary analysis, Whitfield's legal brief, and the notebook of incidents documenting Crane's retaliatory pressure campaign. She had also added, at Whitfield's suggestion, signed statements from 11 people in the community who had been directly affected by Crane's business practices over the previous 2 years. She had collected those statements herself over 4 Sundays after the children's lessons. She had asked each person the same questions in the same order and written down the answers exactly as given without embellishment or summary. And the result was 11 voices speaking plainly about what had been done to them and what it had cost. Old Mr. Garrett signed his statement and looked at her across the kitchen table and said, "You're going to win this." "We have a good case," she said. "No." He shook his head. "You're going to win this, however the commissioner rules. You understand what I mean." She looked at him. "I've been on this mountain 60 years, he said. "I've watched a lot of things fall apart. Droughts, diseases, bad winters, bad men with good lawyers. The thing that decides it isn't the paperwork." He looked at her steadily. "It's whether the people fighting have the same thing at the center of it. These families." He gestured toward the main room, where 4 ranching families were reviewing documents with Whitfield's assistant. "They came because Luke McCall called, but they're staying because of you." Rose did not know what to say to that. "Don't look surprised," he said. "You built something here, young woman, in 4 months on a mountain. That's not a small thing." He went back to his coffee. She sat at the table for a moment after he walked away. The house around her was full of voices and papers, and the particular energy of people who have decided to fight together. And she thought about the first day she had walked into this kitchen and seen bare walls and no curtains and a shelf of almanacs and a man who communicated primarily by fixing things. She thought about how much a house could change. She thought about how much a person could change and whether change was the right word or whether the word was more like uncovering. The thing that was always there becoming visible. Luke came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He looked at the room, the families, the papers, Whitfield's assistant at the table, Danny handing someone coffee with the capable ease of a boy who had learned to be useful, and she felt him beside her, the particular quality of his presence, which she knew now, the way she knew the sound of his boots and the exact temperature at which he took his coffee. "You did this," he said quietly. "We did this." He looked at her. Rose. She looked up at him. "After," he said. Just that. Just the one word carrying everything that wasn't going to be said in a room full of people. She understood him. She understood him the way she understood the iron key and the cedar chest and the third door and the orchard and every other thing that had been offered to her in this house without decoration or preamble. "After," she said. She turned back to the room. He turned back to the room. And the house held them, all of them, 23 people fighting for what was theirs on a Colorado mountain in the dead of winter, and the fire burned high, and the coffee stayed hot, and the case file sat on the kitchen table as solid and real as the land itself. 32 years of documentation, saying simply and without apology, "This is ours, and we are not leaving." The Territorial Land Commissioner would hear them in 6 days. Whatever he decided, they had already won something that Aldous Crane could not file a claim against. Rose knew this the way she knew everything important in her hands first, then her chest, then the part of her that kept count of what was real. She kept count. It was all there. Every bit of it. The Territorial Land Commissioner's name was Edmund Fry, and he ran his hearing the way a man runs a hearing when he has seen every variety of land fraud the Colorado Territory has produced, and is no longer impressed by any of them. He sat at the head of the long table in the Denver Land Office on a Tuesday morning in the first week of March and looked at the case file Rose had prepared and did not speak for 4 minutes. Not 4 seconds. 4 full minutes, during which the room held 23 people in complete silence, 5 ranching families. Whitfield the lawyer, 2 of Crane's attorneys in expensive coats, Aldous Crane himself, and Rose Bennett McCall, age 19, sitting at the table across from the man who was going to decide whether 4 months of work and 32 years of documentation were enough. Luke was beside her. His shoulder was 2 inches from hers. She could feel him the way you feel something solid in a room when everything else is uncertain. Commissioner Fry set down the case file. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "your client's original grant from 1852 places the northern boundary at the pine stand on the ridge. The survey submitted by Crane Timber places that same boundary 12 feet south of the pine stand. Is there any ambiguity in the original survey notation?" "None," Whitfield said. "The territorial surveyor in 1852 used the pine stand as the fixed reference point. The notation is explicit. And the Crane survey uses a benchmark that did not exist in 1852 and cannot be reconciled with the original measurement." Fry looked at Crane's lead attorney. "Counselor." Crane's attorney stood up. He was older than Whitfield and considerably better dressed, and he had the confidence of a man who had won a great many rooms on the strength of those 2 facts alone. "Commissioner, the 1852 survey notation is ambiguous with respect to—" "I read it," Fry said. "It is not ambiguous. Sit down." The attorney sat down. Crane's jaw moved. Fry looked at the supplementary document, the criminal referral for the surveyor. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the notebook of incidents Rose had compiled. He turned pages, slowly reading. He looked up. "Who compiled this?" he said. "My wife," Luke said. Fry looked at Rose. "How long did this take you?" 6 weeks, Rose said. "The entries are dated and sourced." "Yes, sir." "Every incident verified." "Every one. I have signed statements for each entry in the supplementary folder at the back." Fry looked at the folder. He looked at Rose. He had the expression of a man recalibrating something. "How old are you, Mrs. McCall?" 19. The room was very quiet. "All right," Commissioner Fry said. He closed the case file. "I've seen enough." Crane's attorney stood up again immediately. "Commissioner, we haven't had the opportunity to present the full—" "You've had the opportunity," Fry said. "I'm satisfied with what I have. I'm going to take a recess, and I'm going to review the original grants from all 5 families, and I'm going to come back in 2 hours, and I'm going to tell you what I've decided." He stood up. Everyone stood. He left the room. The 2 hours were the longest Rose could remember since the 40 days after the bank notice. She did not pace. Pacing was not useful. She sat in the anteroom with Luke beside her, and Danny on her other side, and the 4 other families arranged around them in various postures of waiting, and she held the iron key in her coat pocket. She had put it there that morning, without thinking about it, the way you carry something that has become a part of your daily weight, and she turned it over in her fingers, and thought about nothing in particular, and everything at once. Mrs. Caldwell came and sat beside her after the first hour. "How are you holding up?" she said quietly. "I'm fine." Rose. She looked at her. I'm afraid, she said. But I've been afraid before, and it doesn't change anything. Mrs. Caldwell put her hand briefly over Rose's. Then she took it back. Neither of them spoke again. Luke at some point during the second hour put his hand over Rose's in her coat pocket, over her hand and the key both, and held it there for exactly the amount of time required to say, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Then he let go. She did not look at him. She did not need to. When Commissioner Fry came back into the room, he stood at the head of the table and did not sit down. I am invalidating all 5 Crane Timber Company survey filings, he said. The boundary adjustments are reversed. The original grants stand as documented. In addition, I am referring the survey findings to the Territorial Attorney General's office for criminal investigation of Hartwell and Associates. He paused. I am also noting in my official record that the documentation provided by the McCall family and their neighbors represents the most thorough and well-organized evidence package this office has received in 11 years of territorial land proceedings. He looked at Rose when he said the last part. She looked back. Congratulations, Mrs. McCall, he said. Your land is yours. The room erupted. Not loudly, these were mountain people, not given to noise, but in the way a room erupts when 23 people release something they have been holding for weeks, a collective exhale that changes the quality of the air. Tom Caldwell shook Luke's hand. Old Mr. Garrett, who had made the Denver trip in a borrowed wagon and was the eldest person in the room by 20 years, said something to no one in particular that sounded like good. Mrs. Pearson started crying quietly and immediately stopped and pretended she hadn't. Crane stood up. His face had gone a color that was not healthy. He said something to his attorney, and the attorney said something back, and then Crane looked across the table at Rose. This isn't finished, he said. Yes, it is, she said. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he walked out. His attorney followed. The door closed. Rose turned to Luke. He was looking at her with the expression she had first seen on the floor of the main room, surrounded by 32 years of paper open and unguarded, and completely present the expression that was the real version of him, without any management at all. You did it, he said. We did it, she said. He looked like he was going to say something else. Then Danny appeared between them with both arms out and hugged Rose with the force of a 14-year-old boy who has been maintaining dignified composure for 6 weeks and is now entirely done with that effort, and she held him and felt him exhale against her shoulder and thought about the kitchen table and the bank notice, and you can't sell her, and $412 and everything that had led to this room, and she was glad, she was entirely and completely glad that she had burned those biscuits on that particular morning and Mrs. Alderman had been in the general store. Spring came to McCall Ranch the way it always came to high mountain country, slowly. And then all at once, and the orchard was the first thing Rose checked every morning. She had pruned the 10 good trees through February, working in the cold with her breath clouding, and her hands in heavy gloves, cutting back 10 years of unmanaged growth to the healthy wood underneath. She had grafted stock onto 4 of the weaker trees, using the method from the agricultural pamphlet she had finally received in January, 3 months after she'd sent for it. She did not know yet whether the grafts would take. She went and looked at them every morning anyway. On the first genuinely warm morning of April, she found 2 of the grafted trees in bud. She stood in the orchard and looked at the small tight buds on branches that had been dead wood 6 weeks ago, and felt something she did not have a precise word for. Something in the neighborhood of vindication, but larger and more personal than that. Something that was about trees, and also about everything that was not trees. She heard Luke come up behind her. 2 of them, she said without turning around. He came to stand beside her. He looked at the buds. He did not say anything for a moment. My mother would have liked you, he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the tree, not at her the way he said things he meant most completely slightly to the side of you, so the weight of it landed without requiring you to receive it straight on. Tell me about her, Rose said. He was quiet for a moment. This was not the silence of reluctance. It was the silence of a man choosing the right entry point for something he had not talked about in a long time. "She planted this orchard the year she married my father," he said. "She said he brought her up this mountain with nothing but his word that it would be worth it. And she decided if she was going to be here, she was going to make something that would outlast the doubt." He looked at the budding graft. "She made preserves every fall, and she gave half of them away, and she said the other half kept us honest about whether the harvest had been good or just good enough." "Which was it mostly?" "Good enough," he said. "And she said that was fine. Good enough and given freely was better than abundant and hoarded." Rose looked at the trees. She was right. She usually was. He paused. "She would have seen you coming up this mountain the way you did 19 years old with one bag and your brother to worry about. And she would have said that's a woman worth knowing." Rose kept her eyes on the trees. Her chest was doing the thing it did now when he said things like this, the particular ache of being known in a way you hadn't prepared for. "Luke," she said. "Yes." She turned to face him. "You said after. In the kitchen. Before Denver." He looked at her. "I remember." "It's after." He held her gaze, and then he did the thing he almost never did. He smiled. A real one, unhurried and complete, the kind that started at the corners of his eyes and arrived at his mouth like something that had been traveling a long way to get there. It changed his whole face. It made him look like the man he must have been before 10 years of carrying, and also like someone new, someone who had put the weight down and was still figuring out how to stand without it. "Yes," he said, "it is." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear that the morning wind had moved just the lightest particular touch, and she leaned into it for exactly 1 second before they both heard Danny's voice from the house calling something about breakfast. And Luke dropped his hand, and Rose turned back to the trees, and they walked back to the house together in the cool April morning, with an inch of space between them that was different now from what it had been yesterday. Different in the way that permanent things are different from the temporary ones they replaced. Danny got his examination results in May. He passed. Not adequately, he passed with the highest score in the territorial district, a fact that the examining board noted in their letter, with a specificity that suggested they were not accustomed to noting it. He sat at the kitchen table with the letter in his hands and read it 3 times and then put it down and looked at Rose and said nothing for a full minute. "Well," she said, "I passed." "I know you passed. The letter also says something else." He looked at it again. "Top score in the district. Which means... He stopped. His voice had done something. He put the letter down carefully, the way you put down something you might break. "Rose." "Danny." "It means the Territorial School Board Scholarship." He looked at her. "It means Denver, Medical College." She sat down across from him. "Yes. That's..." He stopped again. "It's what you worked for," she said. "It's what we worked for." He looked at the letter, then at her, then at the hallway, as though he could see through it to Luke in the barn. "Does he know?" "Not yet." Danny was quiet for a moment. "I want to tell him," he said. Is that strange?" "No," Rose said. "Go tell him." He pushed back from the table and went out, and Rose sat alone in the kitchen with the letter on the table in front of her, and listened to the sound of Danny's boots across the yard, and Luke's voice coming back. She couldn't hear the words, but she heard the register of it, the particular warmth, and she thought about a 14-year-old boy who had said you can't sell her with a cracking voice, and was now going to be a doctor, and she thought that some outcomes were so much larger than the decisions that produced them, that it was almost impossible to trace the line between them. But she could trace it. She had always been able to trace things. Bank notice, general store, iron key, third door, cedar chest, land grant, Commissioner Fry, budding apple trees. And now this, a letter on a kitchen table that meant her brother's life was going to be more than either of them had allowed themselves to imagine on the worst nights of the worst years. She pressed her hand flat on the letter. She let herself feel all of it, just for a minute. She allowed the full weight of it to sit on her chest without managing it. Then she got up and put the coffee on because Danny and Luke would come back in shortly, and they would want coffee, and she had bread rising on the counter that needed to be checked, and life on a working ranch continued regardless of what letters arrived, and that was not a small thing either. The reliability of it, the ongoingness, the fact that there was always something that needed doing, and she was the kind of person who did it. That had always been true. It had just finally found the right place to be true in. The summer brought changes Rose had not fully anticipated. The word had spread the way word spreads in small mountain communities, person to person. And Sunday to Sunday, that McCall Ranch was a place where struggling families could find a meal and a night's shelter and practical help without conditions attached. It started with a widow named Clara Briggs, who had lost her homestead to a genuine bank failure in June, and arrived at the ranch with 3 children and no plan. And Luke had said simply, "You can stay in the north room until you find your footing." And Rose had said, "The children can join the Sunday school." And Clara Briggs had stood in the yard and cried for 10 minutes and then come inside and started helping with dinner. Clara stayed 6 weeks. She left with a plan, a small amount of money. Luke had found work for her to earn, and a letter of introduction Rose had written to a women's employment organization in Denver that she had read about in the newspaper. After Clara, there was a family of 4 from the east side of the county who had lost their crops to an early frost. After them, 2 orphaned brothers, age 8 and 11, whose nearest relation was in New Mexico and could not be reached. After them, a woman named Ida, who would not say what she was running from, but wore her reasons visibly enough that no one asked. By August, the back room that had started as a Sunday school had permanent chalk marks on the wall where Rose tracked her students' progress. The north room had been occupied continuously since June. Danny's old room had a new occupant, a boy named William, who was 11 and had arrived with the 2 orphaned brothers and turned out to have a gift for arithmetic that Rose was already planning to develop. Luke said one evening in August, "We're going to need to build." "I know," Rose said. "Another room at least. Possibly 2. "The old cabin on the east field," she said. "You said it was structurally sound." "With work." "I can plan the renovation if you do the work." He looked at her. "You've already planned it." "I've started." He almost laughed, the real one, the one she had made a private, ongoing project of producing. "Show me." She showed him. They sat at the kitchen table with her sketches and his knowledge of the building's actual structure, and they argued productively for an hour about load-bearing walls and window placement, and whether the east-facing orientation was an advantage or a problem in winter. And at the end of that hour, they had something that was better than what either of them had started with.